Hello, and welcome to the Sci-Fi Show.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen. So, we're back. We're starting early this week, which is good because I want to have a mix. So, if you're here for the actual stream, there's about 50 minutes of music first, but I will be cutting this out. So, if you're catching a rerun, this should go, at least in the next couple of days, straight to it. So, what are we doing tonight? That's what you really want to know. Well, tonight we're going to be discussing science. In fact, whether a scientific theory can ever be accepted or only refuted, or should I say proven. So we're going to be discussing a number of little things. We'll cover off briefly things like induction and deduction and Popper's falsification and all of that sort of stuff. And we'll be demonstrating why philosophy is an important part to science, because this is crossing back and forth between science and philosophy of science. So the thinking is both scientific and philosophical, and you'll be able to see how these things blend together, and that's the idea of it. So that's it really. Hopefully you'll stick around and enjoy some tunes with us. If not, we'll catch you at the live show in about 50 minutes. Lone Wolf says, are you scientifically refuting the scientific theory tonight? Well, I'll just have to wait and find out. Hello, and welcome to the Sci-Fi Show. I'm Joe.
My mouse wasn't working, but I'm Dave.
Well, you know, what's a sci-fi show with at least one technical hiccup? I thought with a number of stacked mixes at the beginning of that, that would be our hiccups for the evening, but never mind. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're all well. Thank you for joining me for the mix if you did, and those of you who've come back for the main part of the show, well, thank you for being here as well. I know the drum and bass or any sort of electronic music isn't for everybody, so I don't expect everyone to stay around, and let's face it, there aren't many people who would want to listen to the same sort of music and philosophy. So I get that it can be a bit off-putting to some people, which is why I cut it out of our final streams. Now, today we're going to be covering off something that, well, it's come about for a number of different reasons. Now, on the one hand, I think it's good to cover off certain things from within philosophy and things that people don't understand about philosophy and the useful side of philosophy. And tonight's question sort of ties into why philosophy is useful to science. But also, there's been a lot of science miscommunication on social media, especially recently. And that's why we've released a couple of articles on certain things. I mean, Dave, not your most recent one, but your one before that sort of addressed some of the people who get corrected and they stick to their dogma. And I wrote two articles, one about forming a hypothesis and the next about issues with people getting the null hypothesis wrong, and also addressed a few other erroneous statements after that. Maybe I should have left it as just the null hypothesis and done the other bit as a second article, I don't know. But tonight is going to sort of lean into that, and there's going to be probably, I mean, Dave's going to take us away on this, but I imagine he's going to cover off things like a little bit of deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning. We're going to go into falsification and all of that sort of thing to answer the question, which is, Dave?
Is it true that a scientific theory can be refuted but never verified? And it is, like you say, it's Popper's falsification. And the reason we're doing this is last week we thought, why not kind of go through the questions I was kind of given on my major assignments during my undergrad. Thought that might be interesting and kind of show what goes into an undergrad philosophy degree.
Yeah, exactly. So we've started a sub playlist as part of the sci-fi stream to questions for an undergrad. So if you ever see on the our show logo, it says Q4U. That's going to be because it's one of the questions for an undergrad. And as you said, Dave, we're going to be covering off a number of these. We'll do them hit and miss, sort of here and there. We won't bore you with them all the time. We find them interesting, but I understand that not everybody is necessarily interested in what an undergrad does. So we'll keep it varied as we always do. But Dave, there was a few things you wanted to say before we actually really got into the meat of the topic tonight, wasn't there?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that not all undergrad programs are the same, so they won't all have been just like mine was. There are certain kind of overlaps in syllabuses, but most universities kind of have their own syllabus. They just have to hit certain topics. And you kind of, most universities will want to give the student as much information as possible. And the way mine worked was, in my very first year, it was sort of a general arts and social sciences kind of lead. And then the second year was pure philosophy, which I count as my first year philosophy. Because that was the year dedicated to philosophy. Whereas in the first year, there was like art criticism, music criticism, history, studying history, historical research and all that kind of stuff, along with some philosophy. And in my first year philosophy, which is, my second year undergrad, we had 8 assignments, major assignments that we had to write, or 7. I can't remember now. And then you had tests and you had little essays and that kind of stuff. So these are the major assignments. And it was split up into blocks. And it was like a block on the self, a block on the mind, a block on epistemology, a block on ethics, that kind of thing. And each one lasted about a month. So this assignment was the epistemology block major assignment, so to speak.
Awesome. And where you mentioned that people actually do have different syllabuses, well, obviously they'll have different professors and things like that, and they'll have different courses. We've met a few people online that hate philosophy because they did a course and it was awful. Or
yeah, they've done like an intro to philosophy course and they thought that was the whole of what philosophy was like, but mine wasn't so much teaching you the history of philosophy or basic introductory things. It was kind of more in depth than that. It was going into, like, tonight we're going to be discussing the falsification. There was skepticism involved, Thomas Kuhn's scientific revolutions, all different kinds of epistemology in that one block.
Yeah. So, I mean, even those people out there who say they hate philosophy because they've actually done a bit, I think perhaps they're a bit jaded based on a bad experience. There was one person that thought that their singular philosophy professor that they did this tiny, like, 8-week course on was indicative of all philosophy professors and all philosophy courses. And it was just like, okay, that's not how it is.
No, not how it is at all. I mean, it can be, obviously. But if you're doing an intro to philosophy course as part of a bigger degree, your focus isn't on philosophy. It's probably just involves teaching you some basic ideas, like some basic ideas about logic, some basic ideas about skepticism, and probably some Plato, some Aristotle and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, the way to think about it is every teacher you ever had the same, or even every teacher for the same subject being exactly the same. I can tell you my experience, obviously, but none of my teachers at school were the same as each other. You would get certain types. They didn't always teach the same subjects, but you always had the sort of certain types of teacher. Just as you could say on a generalistic scale, you do have certain types of people, but you still can't generalize and whittle down all of their qualities just because, they're a bit like this type of person. But you can make certain generalizations, but I cannot say that from subject to subject there were, a consistent type of teacher would teach this sort of thing. So making a hasty generalization about philosophy and philosophers based on an 8-week course or whatever it was and one professor doesn't show particularly good reasoning.
I mean, you just have to look at the difference in philosophers online. Look at somebody like Stephen Law, Hans-Jörg Mueller from Carefree Wandering, Gregory Sadler. They're all very laid-back, easygoing guys who just enjoy discussing philosophy, and you can hear the intelligence behind it, but they speak very kind of casually, I guess is the words I'm looking for. They speak to you like a person, whereas you also get those philosophers who like to use all the big terms and kind of speak as you would expect a philosophy person to speak, or, that kind of image of how you expect a philosopher to be. So even just there, you can see there's just many approaches from within philosophy itself.
Yeah, most definitely. So anyway, I think that sort of laid the ground.
Yeah.
And I don't think that that will necessarily convince anyone who hates philosophy for whatever reason to suddenly go, maybe I should reconsider things.
Well, philosophy has a very bad reputation within the atheist and skeptic community as it is. And a lot of them are just following the voices of people like Aaron Ra. Philosophy is useless, can't teach us anything. You can't discover truth through philosophy. But this question kind of gives you an example of how philosophy contributes to science and how it can be used to get at truth, because philosophy can be helped to refine the tools of science. I mean, a lot of scientists will obviously not need the philosophy of science, not need falsification. They just go ahead and do science. But Karl Popper is actually respected amongst many scientists.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I mean, I do understand that some scientists go, well, we've taken all the tools from philosophy, we don't need it anymore. They accept that they've got them, but they feel that they don't need philosophy to do it, even though if they're ever refining it, they are actually doing the philosophy themselves. But there's still things that philosophy benefits science on. I'll agree that the progress you might see from philosophy might be slower. And sometimes it needs science to investigate certain things and go, well, here's the answer for this bit, so that they can then take on the next bit of philosophy. But it's sort of like a symbiotic relationship where they feed into each other. So
it is. And there's questions science can't answer, which are in the realm of philosophy. I mean, if you think about the question of how best to do science, you can't discover that through science.
No.
Because it's not a part of the natural world that you're investigating. You're investigating a concept and a methodology. Whereas you can say the same for philosophy. Philosophy isn't going to get you to what minerals exist on the moon, or tell you what the surface of Mars is like. You can make a pretty good guess if, but you need science to actually get to the actual truth of that matter.
Yeah, most definitely. I think they're both fantastic tools. I mean, that's why it's the sci-fi show. You know, it's why Luke very graciously every couple of weeks does his psyched show on a Monday. Which
Yeah, but that's pseudoscience.
But yeah, so this is one of the things I think people forget, that some people get too in one lane. And it's all about the science. I mean, there's nothing wrong with preferring science at all, but statements like philosophy is useless are sort of erroneous, because science wouldn't be what it is today without philosophy. And who knows what will happen going forward? You know, maybe science will need new philosophy less and less. That may well be the case. But as Dave said, there's still questions that are outside of the realm of science. I mean, think about morality. That's one of many things that science can't answer. You know, it can help with it. You can have studies on things like abuse, but
well, if you think about Sam Harris's thing, he says science can give us morality. But he begins by presupposing what morality is. He's not actually got there through science. He's not actually discovered some property of the universe called morality. He started with a philosophical concept and said, well, we can investigate these ideas through science. So it's not quite the same as getting morality from science.
Exactly. You hear similar things like, learning the natural sciences will teach you skepticism. What? What? It might make you skeptical of certain claims that are really outside of things, but it won't teach you what skepticism is, especially the different types of skepticism and how to apply it properly so that it is a virtue rather than a vice.
Yeah, good callback. I think in something like that, it could teach you to be skeptical, but based on the idea, something like David Hume, we should apply our beliefs to the evidence presented to us. And that's kind of what science is doing. But I'm not sure it would make you skeptical as such. It wouldn't say, well, I doubt that claim. It's just, have you got the evidence for it? No, well then, I'll wait until you have sufficient evidence to back up that claim. And then what would sufficient evidence be? To get to the idea of what sufficient evidence would be, you would need some kind of philosophical concept. Yeah.
Even if you say it's not philosophy, it is. It's like eating chocolate and saying, I'm not eating chocolate. Well, okay, call it what you like, but the referent is still the same. We're still talking.
It's the same.
Yeah. You're not calling it philosophy, and you're saying you're not doing philosophy, but what you're doing is exactly that. Give it a new name. If that makes you happy, right, call it something else. But it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
What is the problem with philosophy? And I get it. I mean, there are some big names who've poo-pooed it over the years, especially Stephen Hawking, you know? And he was a brilliant man, absolutely intelligent, love his books as well. And he's someone who, kind of like the way Stephen Law writes about philosophy and makes it really interesting and engaging, even if it's quite a dry subject that he's going over. I found Stephen Law did the same. Stephen Law? What? Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking also does the same thing with science. Like when I read Brief History of Time and Briefer History of Time, for example, like they were very engaging books. They were written in such a way that it was another one that you just didn't put down. Occasionally it got a bit hard and I needed to cool off and have a beer. But it was still so very, very engaging. So these are great people. But yeah, it's a shame that there is this stigma against philosophy, because as we've explained, you know, even if You don't want to use the word philosophy when you're doing certain things because it's got a dirty word, dirty taste in your mouth. There are big names who have told you philosophy is dead and so on and so forth, and you've just accepted it, you've agreed with them. In a lot of cases, people are still doing philosophy and they don't want to. Well, when they don't think they are, when they say they're not. Philosophy is very useful. Science is very useful. Both are applied in different areas. Science can give us some fantastic answers. And what we're talking about tonight is both philosophy and science. And we're answering the question, is it true that a scientific theory can be refuted but never verified?
Yeah, and this comes, like we said earlier, this comes from Popper. And it comes from Conjectures and Refutations and from an essay and speech he gave somewhere. Sorry, it's been a very long couple of days, so my brain isn't functioning quite right. I can't remember where the original kind of essay paper came from, but it started out as him trying to figure out the demarcation between science and pseudoscience.
Yeah.
And yeah, his idea was that you can have, what he used was Marxism and Freudianism. And you can have a theory that seems to explain everything. Go back to the social constructionism thing that we did a couple of weeks ago. You could apply that framework to anything. And when you start looking for things to actually kind of back it up, you start seeing them all over the place. And the same can be true of Marxism. Once you start applying that theory to how the world works, and you start to see these historical battles and historical injustices and all that kind of stuff, you start to see Marxism everywhere. And same with like Freudian theories. He posits a theory, and then you can start to see that theory everywhere. And everything seems to be evidence for it. But is that really a good way to go about figuring things out about the world? Because if everything supports your theory and you can have two theories that are different theories, but all the evidence supports both, then how do you actually demarcate between those two theories?
Which makes sense, yeah. It's quite interesting, isn't it, really? I mean, it's hard to actually think of a real world example today where you could have something where all the evidence supports both of them to the same conclusion. It's hard for me to imagine one anyway. Maybe my imagination's just not very good.
Mine isn't. That's why I do philosophy.
But it's true. I mean, how can we really tell if a scientific theory is any good at all? So there is a bit of a difference, I mean, between a scientific theory and the colloquial use of theory, which I'm just going to put out there. So a scientific theory is basically an explanation of all the scientific laws and facts about some sort of natural part of or some part of the natural world, should I say. So it's a very robust explanation of all the information, basically. I mean, this is there's more to it, more layers to it, but that's a really simplistic way of thinking about it. Whereas a theory, in the colloquial sense, is just an idea. Now, before you get to all of that point of having the theories, you've got your hypothesis. So you might have your idea, first of all, and you have a think about it, and you do a bit of background research, you look into it, and you start thinking, right, well, with this, I think, X will happen. And for a hypothesis to be valid within science, so for it to be considered an actual hypothesis, it needs to be falsifiable and to be able to be operationalized. So what that means is you need to be able to prove this thing false if you can, and you actually need to be able to operationalize it. So that means that you can fully describe all the qualities and variables and how you will measure, in an experiment, if you were to do one. You don't have to do one, but you have to be able to design the experiment. Otherwise, it's just considered conjecture in a colloquial way to mean idea as well, unfortunately. And that causes confusion, and then you get the issues with the null hypothesis, which we've gone over in detail recently. We've got a couple of articles, and there's been a bunch of streams and all of that. And I do plan on doing an article reading on it, but let's leave that one for another day. And Dave, take it away.
Well, what you just brought up there was like a really good point. The whole falsifiable thing, this is what Popper kind of came up with. When he was looking at various theories, he looked at Freudian theories and he looked at Marxist theories, and he could see that there was no way to actually tell which one was right out of the two. But looking at Einstein's theory of general relativity, he noticed that in Einstein's theory, he made some very bold predictions. Predictions so bold that if they were shown to be false, then the whole theory would be shown to be false. And according to him, that's what demarcates science from pseudoscience. It's the idea that when you present this hypothesis or this theory, there's a way to show that it's not right. There's a way to falsify it. And it makes predictions about what we should see. Whereas, and those predictions, if not found, just like if you think about evolution, if we find a fossil in the wrong layer, it can cause us to question evolution. If we find a ton in the wrong layer, well, then evolution doesn't seem to be a very good theory. Mm-hmm. So this is what demarcates a scientific theory from pseudoscientific theory.
Yeah, so in that sense, it's well, as you said, falsifiability. It's using deductive reasoning, essentially, on the theory, on the hypothesis. It's saying, here we go, here's our explanations, here's the predictions that we make from our explanations. Oh, look, these predictions aren't coming forward. Right, well, that one's wrong, or you may never actually fully throw one out. You just sort of might tweak it and change a few things and realize it wasn't as complete or robust as it was in the first place. And I think that's one of the better things about science is the fact that there is this feedback loop that goes into things, and it's constantly trying to prove itself wrong.
It is, yeah. And that's what kind of separates it as well from a lot of other ideas. Like, how many times have you ever heard, say, really stupid kind of alternative medicine kind of things? Well, it'll make you feel happier and healthier all day. Okay, but then so can having a cup of coffee. So how do you know that it's not the cup of coffee doing it and not your alternate medicine? And if there's no way to actually show that it's not the alternate medicine, then it can't be any kind of science.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sort of separate the two, isn't it? Really, is the fact that, as you say, pseudoscience isn't falsifiable, or other things as well. Like when people talk about things in a colloquial sense, I mean, it's one of the things that we'd talk about with theism in general, should we say. It's not falsifiable. You might be able to falsify specific God claims based on all the parameters, all the variables. You'd have enough information, and you might even be able to, at the very least, design a logical experiment, even if you wouldn't be able to do, a study there might be certain things that you could test, like they have done with the efficacy of prayer. But theism in general isn't something that is, at least right now, falsifiable. So in the realm of science, neither theism or atheism could be considered a hypothesis. They're at the idea stage. They are propositions. They're propositional. But if we're thinking about it in scientific terms, you're at that very first stage of, yeah, I think that, there could be a God. Right?
Yeah.
It's not in the realm of science. And we've got to, on the big picture side of things, stop trying to confuse,
Yeah. I think one of the reasons that happens is because science is the most respectable thing in these communities. So if it sounds scientific, then it must be a respectable option and opinion. But like with Popper, if it's not falsifiable, it's not science.
Mm-hmm.
If it can't be tested and tested in the real world, it can't be science.
Mm-hmm.
And, if there's nothing you can discover that proves it wrong, then it can't be science.
Yep.
So a lot of the stuff that people kind of hold out, like God doesn't exist, is the null hypothesis. Well, if that's not testable, it's not testable in the real world, if it's not falsifiable. And if God is this outside of the natural world, then it can't be tested in this world.
Because what does science do?
Test in the real world. And if it can't be tested in the real world, then it's not science. So it can't be the null hypothesis in any way except some kind of colloquial usage that's where they're choosing to co-opt that term as a form of sounding more respectable, sounding more scientific. But when you actually break it down, you realize, well, there's nothing actually scientific about it. They're just co-opting this term to give it a veneer of respectability.
Steen actually says something, science by default rules out the supernatural. If a variable of the supernatural ever becomes measurable, the metaphysical can enter the scientific realm. So, I mean, this is what we were saying, like, if you have certain qualities, like the efficacy of prayer on healing sick patients, for example, you could see, set up a study to see, people being, they've been done, and there was no significant difference between the people that were being prayed for. So the study was there was group 1 that knew they were being prayed for, group 2 that knew that they didn't know they were being prayed for but were being prayed for, and group 3 that knew they weren't be. And the 2 groups that didn't know that they were being prayed for or not performed slightly better than the people that knew that they were being prayed for. There was another study that showed that it was pretty much of a muchness. There was no really significant difference. Basically, on healing, there's no significant difference between people who are being prayed for and people who are not, whether they know it or not. So that is the null in that regard, right? But that is something that is supposed to be appealing to a supernatural entity to have an effect on the physical world. So you could, say something there. Now, transubstantiation. At what point is that supposed to turn into the body of Christ, for example? Because if that's supposed to happen the second it hits the back of your throat, you could then gut punch someone, make them throw it back up, and test it to see if it had turned to a body or not. And then you could actually say, right, well, no, it doesn't happen. Someone could have a thing saying, well, God knew that it was going to happen that way. So you could find an excuse for why it didn't. But anything where there is supposed to be a physical effect, like Steen says, you could enter the scientific realm. But in general, the supernatural is above the natural order, so it can't be tested by science. The The best logic experiments always get tabled. My pun above isn't always the truth. Sometimes it's false. Not having pineapple on pizza is the null hypothesis. Shut up, Icarus. So Steen says the prayer studies don't measure prayers as in metaphysical impact. It measured psychological impact of prayer. No, it measured the healing impact of prayer. So it wasn't doing the psychological impact. It was seeing if people got better. So they were sick people with whatever they had, variety of different people in hospitals, seeing if their recovery was faster than people with equivalent illnesses. So that you had... So the first group that I mentioned was people who knew they were being prayed for, people that didn't know they were being prayed for, and people who knew they weren't being prayed for. Then there was also another one done with people who were being prayed for and weren't being prayed for. There may be other studies as well, but it was just when I was looking into this, however long ago, they were the two that sort of came up. And to be fair, the sample size wasn't particularly massive. I'd love to see far more done on this, but at the moment, we have not rejected the null. There is no significant difference between people being prayed for and people not being prayed for. So... you're right that the actual physical healing is linked to mind state and not metaphysical. We know about stress impacts. Yeah, you're right. So positive thinking and stuff like that does actually help you heal better, and there is a chance to see that, if people think that they're being prayed for, that would they heal better because they feel better. But even still, I mean, in the study with the three groups, the people who knew they were being prayed for and would have had that better mental state actually healed slightly worse than the other two groups. Not significantly worse, but just that little bit, perform that little bit worse. But the point there is, I get that you're talking to that, but if there was a God and prayer had the effect, what they're doing is saying, can we ask God to heal these people and they be healed? So that's the supernatural affecting the natural. I understand that in reality, without there being any gods, the only effect that it would really have is, do they feel better for being prayed for? And does that help them heal? But supposing there is a God, and he has the ability to heal people, does he heal people? So you're not proving that God doesn't exist with this experiment. You're proving that... proving's the wrong word, but you're showing that under these conditions, that even though God may have the power to do this, he doesn't. He doesn't answer prayers to heal people. That's all you're really showing. What do prime numbers and stoners have in common? The higher they are, the more spaced out they get. But yes, anyway, so where were we, Dave?
Well, let's go back to what you said about the deductive things. This is one of the things that kind of Popper said, that science doesn't work on induction. It works on deduction. Something that'll probably come as a surprise to many scientists. Because science is basically inductive. You get your things from the real world and from observations in the real world. But Popper says that's not quite the case. Most people would argue that the observations come before the hypothesis. And that might be true, but Popper says that's more a kind of proto-hypothesis. You're sort of making these general observations, which give you an idea, which you then form into a hypothesis, and then you sort of narrow down your observations.
Mm-hmm.
You then test for them sort of inductively, and then it becomes a theory. And from that theory, you start making deductive arguments. Sort of think of the prayer thing. You make a bunch of observations. It doesn't seem to be the case that prayer does anything. So in your theory, you would put something like, if God answered prayers, for sick people, we would see people being healed. We don't see people being healed. Therefore, God doesn't answer prayers to heal people. So you use those, or, I mean, you could go the other way around and say, if God heals people through prayer, we would see people being healed. We see people being healed, therefore God heals people through prayer. And that's how the theories work. You make these bold predictions using deductive statements, and you falsify those deductive arguments. And because the thing is with induction, you can never really get to a truth.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how many times you see a white swan, you can never say all swans are white.
True. Yeah, it raises the probability.
Yeah.
But it's highly probable that all swans are white. It's highly probable. That's the way you should phrase it, rather than...
Exactly. And with the deduction, you would go, if all swans are white, we would only find white swans. Or, I guess that's not a good example, but if all swans are white, there would be no black swans. There's a black swan, therefore not all swans are white. And that's how you would form and falsify that thing. Because if you just say, I've found X amount of white swans, so therefore all swans are white, there's nothing really to go about until you find a black swan. You can't. There is no falsification of that argument. So you make this bold prediction, and even once you find that black swan, you would be making a sort of deductive argument. Once you find the black swan, well, if all swans are white, we wouldn't have found this black swan. We found this black swan, therefore not all all swans are white.
Mm.
So that was Popper's idea. And another reason why he said that we shouldn't use induction only and we should go with deduction and go with falsification is to stop a kind of fanaticism. Stop this idea that, everything proves the theory. Stop you discarding things from, well, that doesn't fit with the theory, so therefore it can't be the case.
Kind of how you might see people, like especially you see some young Earth creationists or biblical literalists as an example. Well, yeah, it doesn't fit, so it must be wrong because the Bible's right.
Or a good example with the young Earth creationists, we have found certain fossils in the like in a mountain somewhere. So therefore, that proves young Earth creationism because the only way they could have got up there was a global flood. So therefore, that proves the global flood too. When really the answer is just that things get picked up from the sea and moved to the top of mountains all the time. That's why we see frogs rain down in certain places and fish rain down in other places.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. And actually, there's apparently a classic example where Darwin predicted an unknown orchid to exist based on the tongue of a moth.
Perfect example of science making a bold prediction. And that's why it's better to be true, because if you don't find this orchid, then, or if you find the orchid and it's not likely to be suspected and there's no match between the moth and the orchid or what have you, then it seems to be that at least this part of the theory is false.
Yeah. So essentially what we're saying is that every step of the way, and I know we've said it a couple of times, is science does a very good job at especially since Popper anyway, trying to prove things false. Now, was it Popper who actually came up with falsification himself, or Was it something that was sort of around, and he went, "Nah, that's what it is. We're gonna do that. I'm gonna take this thing."
As far as I know, it was Popper.
Okay.
I mean, maybe it was going around, but he's the one that actually put it down and hypothesized it or conceptualized it.
And championed it.
Yeah.
I mean, everything I've read on it has said, it's Popper's falsification. Popper created it. So
that's why it's called Popperian falsification. Yeah.
But it's one of those things where you quite often get people. I mean, another bad statement someone makes about philosophy is it's all descriptive. All philosophy does is describe things as they're happening. And that's what philosophy of science does. They just write down what scientists are already doing.
Yeah. Well, very clearly here, we're seeing something that's not descriptive. We're seeing something that's normative. It's not discussing how it is, because back then, Freudianism was considered a science. Marxism was considered a science because it was an attempt to explain the world as it is. What he did was come in and he gave a kind of normative framework for how to make science work and separate it from pseudoscience, and better ways to make it self-regulating and self-checking to stop kind of fanaticism going on. And, if we just say, well, we found all this evidence that proves the theory, we enter a kind of dogmatism then, and we stop searching for whether or not it's true. So what scientists should be doing is coming up with these grand ideas, these grand theories, these grand hypotheses. And the way to search for truth is not to go, well, all we found is white swans. All swans are white then. The way to find truth is to say, all we found so far is white swans. So it seems likely. But until we've checked all these different places, we can't know.
Yeah.
That's the thing. If we just go by observations now, well, we've never observed in the thousands of years that we've been here, we've never observed aliens. No one's ever wrote about them. We have no physical evidence for them. Therefore, aliens don't exist. Well, there's a vast universe out there that we've not explored. So how could it be the case? So it's better to go, if aliens exist, we should find them in a star system like ours, especially if, it resembles ours with a planet with about the same size, about the same gravity, water. If evolution is true, we should find these things. Therefore, if we do find one of these planets and it doesn't have any life at all, that seems to lower the probability that, life exists out there. But again, we won't know until we've discovered everywhere. More.
Yeah. And again, it's lowering the probability or raising the probability. Actually, just a sideline. On Netflix, I started watching this thing, which this discussion has just reminded me of. It was looking at different planets in the universe that could potentially sort of host life, but we've got no way of finding out. But based on the qualities of these planets, how the life would have evolved on them and the creatures and how they would look. And obviously it's pure conjecture, but it was really interesting because they had very good justifications for why they would do it. Well, because there's on this particular planet, that there's this much more gravity, but the winds are this much harsher, and so on and so forth. And it was like the way they described absolutely everything. It was just like it was really solid conjecture.
Well, that's it. You can have solid conjecture. You just don't have stuff to back it up at the moment. And that is one of the things that a hypothesis. I think it's Feynman who once said, how does science work? Well, first you make a guess, and then you find out how to show evidence that the guess is likely, and then you find evidence to show that, then you look for ways to show that the guess is false. And a hypothesis is generally a guess, but if you go into it with the most amount of information from previous inductions, it's a more refined guess.
Yeah. It's as we've said before, it's got to be falsifiable and the ability to be operationalized. So
that's it, yeah. And that's another thing that kind of Popper argues, that a good hypothesis, well, it's a guess. It will tell us what we should be looking for if this guess is correct, and what we should. This is the falsifiability part. What we should be looking for if the guess is false.
On the fine front, there's Randolph's put a couple of quotes saying, "If you thought that science was certain, well, that's just an error on your part," and that's true. Science doesn't usually deal in absolute truths. You know, it's got a fallibilistic approach. You know, this is well evidenced and so far has not been proved wrong. And as Feckinell says, science is about being less and less wrong. And that's
spot on.
That is spot on. It's a really great way of putting it. Really nice and concise as well. Especially since falsification. You know, before that might have been the goal. But there is a problem with models that are based purely on induction. And you know what? Before Popper, there may have been people that went, "Oh no, crap! I need to change this because this bit doesn't work." But a lot of the science was purely inductive, and it wasn't until Popper came in and was like, I imagine that's how you do it.
Yeah, you'd go on and on with the induction, kind of finding more and more that kind of proves the hypothesis. But you might accidentally come across something that disproved it, rather than actively going out and finding stuff that disproved it.
Yeah. Sorry. There's lots of things coming on in the chat. There's a few quotes coming in, but still catching up. But I love the prayer study, in part because it was funded by the Templeton Foundation. If anyone was motivated to find an effect, it would be them. That's an interesting one. I can't remember who did it. I remember one was done with religious affiliation, and the other one that I looked into, I got no clue whether it did or it didn't. But it's quite funny when you see this. It's also like the the anti-vaxxers that paid for the study into autism and the link between the MMR, and the study found nothing. Which definitely tickled me. Much like the flat earthers and their what was it? Their video that they did on Netflix,
Behind the Curve.
That's the one. And throughout that, they basically showed themselves all false as well.
Yeah, it was the shine a light from
the two
one
dots.
side. Yeah, and it should match level, but they found, what was it, like an 8-foot difference, and that's what the math calculated it would be if there was a curve in the Earth. Yeah. And again, that would be an example of a bold prediction for the Earth not to be flat. And them doing that, if they'd have got it, then that would have falsified the claim that the Earth is not flat.
Yeah, most definitely. Oh, sorry. Deary me. Don't know where that suddenly come from. But yes, I think that science obviously does a very good job at sort of proving things false. As Feckinell said, you get less and less wrong because you chip away at your hypotheses, your theories, and everything like that. Yes, it did, Randolph. But in that case, now we did say, science doesn't really deal in absolutes. So I suppose you could say an absolute is once you prove something false. That is kind of an absolute. Maybe it doesn't deal in absolute truths.
Well, here's the thing. A lot of people have this idea, and this is kind of Thomas Kuhn's criticism. A lot of people have this idea that when a theory is falsified, it's cast aside.
Yeah, not completely, not always anyway.
No, not at all. Most of the time, science works from these kind of frameworks. So you have this Copernican, the rotation of the planets and stuff. You had different theories, and people seem to work from these different theories. You think of Newton and Einstein. Newton still hasn't been completely discarded because it's a simpler theory. And we can still make predictions from it. But for grander spaces, Einstein's is used. And Einstein's theory can only get us back so far. Once you get back to the beginning of the universe, it all seems to fall apart. So theories aren't quite discarded. They're reworked. The bits that are usable are taken from them, and then it's worked on and improved. So it doesn't quite work like people think. The only time it really makes a massive change is when there's a complete revolution in the paradigm. And you could say that Einstein's was a revolution in the paradigm because it changed how we looked at everything. We now have GPS. We can now calculate greater distances. We can understand things better. We know that light is a particle because it bends in gravity, which, Newton's theory didn't tell us. So there was a revolution and the framework changed. And this is one of the things that Kuhn kind of argued against Popperian falsification. Well, it's true that this works. It ignores the fact that science works within these paradigms. And it ignores the fact that scientists don't discard entire theories when it's falsified. They refine them. Mm-hmm. So a theory isn't necessarily proven false. It's just a part of the theory is proven false. The stuff that's still workable might be kept.
Or even absorbed into a new theory.
A new theory, yeah, a new paradigm. So Popper's falsification isn't quite right. And now let's throw another spanner into the works here. People used to believe that the sun was small. Yeah. But scientists hypothesized that the sun was actually very large. Now they did tests, once they had the ability to do these tests, and they found that the sun was a great deal larger than the Earth. So they falsified it, but they've also proven it.
Yeah.
So there does seem to be some scientific theories that are proved. They're not just refuted. They're verified. The claim, the hypothesis, the theory is actually verified.
Yeah, I suppose when it's more of a singular thing like that, you could, when it's something like the size of something, when you can verify it, I guess there are. I mean, that's what I said. In general, science doesn't deal in absolutes. Generally, it doesn't deal with an absolute true or an absolute. But there are obviously times. There's also 0 degrees Kelvin. Now, catching up with some of the chat. So a few comments I'm going to read out in a row and then answer something. So consensus in science is something you should trust more than other things. you should trust the consensus of experts because experts are usually right, even when they disagree with you. Lone Wolf then says, appeal to authority is still a fallacy. Steen says, appeal to authority is a fallacy, but the world would move so slowly if we didn't use it. And Overnator says, appeal to justified authority in inductive argument is not a fallacy. And Reason Doubt says, citing experts is not fallacious. And Wolf says, not if you are just citing them and not trying to substantiate a claim on only that one citation. And I think what you just said there, Wolf, is what I would generally say is, if the only reason you think something is true is, well, Dawkins said it, that's generally quite fallacious. I might say that if it was something about evolutionary biology, it's not as fallacious. I'd still say that maybe you should look into it and see if there is a consensus. You know, if it's his paper that has been peer reviewed, then obviously you've got that there. Whereas if it's a tweet from him, you know, there's going to be a bit of bias there. But it should only be in the subject that they're an expert in. You wouldn't necessarily trust him on your plumbing or you know, fixing your engine. When I go to my doctor and they give me medication, I trust them and their schooling and me giving them all the symptoms I have and them coming to a conclusion, you know, maybe referencing a few things if they need to and saying, this seems like this would be the best possible solution for your thing. I am trusting one expert to deal with me. If I didn't trust them, I'd be stupid to take the medication or do the things that they said, right? So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily a fallacious, like, appeal to authority. I would say, though, that you try the medication and if it doesn't work, you go back to the doctor. You know, you don't say, oh, well, it's not working, but I'm just going to keep taking it and not tell the doctor it's not working. That would be silly. I think, especially if there's multiple experts, like Reason to Doubt said, citing experts is not fallacious. If there are multiple experts saying the same thing, it's great. That adds far more weight to it. I mean, we're not scientists. You know, we can't go out there and do the experiments. We've got to trust the consensus of the experts. We can read the papers and the studies, and from what we can understand of them, we can make our own conclusions. Sure. Some of it's very, very technical. You know, like, and it's supposed to be. It's complex stuff. Like, there's people who've studied for years and years and years and years to get to where they are. And you know, and I bet they still even struggle reading other people's papers as well. You know,
that's a great point that you make there. When you argue that, you know, there is testimony that can be trusted, a lot of atheists and skeptics will say, no, you can't trust testimony. Testimony can never give us knowledge. You'll bring up something like, well, everything you know about evolution, everything you know about physics, you've got that from testimony. Yeah, you haven't gone out and done them. And a lot of the time you'll get an answer like, well, you can go out and do them. That's the thing. That's why it's not testimony. Most people won't be capable of doing those kind of tests, or they don't have the knowledge, the background knowledge, or the knowledge of math to do a lot of it. They're just accepting it. And like most of them will say, oh, argument from authority, but most of them get their information from that same authority that they're saying is an argument from authority. And they're arguing like evolution is true. Look at all these experiments that have been done. Nobody's ever falsified it. It's, you know, the more and more data we collect, the more and more it seems true. All that's coming from testimony. And all that's coming from an authority. The only time that they'll actually fling out that argument from authority is when they don't want to accept some data point.
Yep. It's very true. Absolutely true. Daniel Kelly. How you doing, Daniel? Been a while since I've seen you, dude. One of my favorite hypothesis refinements was the colored smudges in the night sky. Some said that they were distant galaxies, others said they were clouds of gas. Both were partly right and partly wrong. Yeah, awesome. That's a really good example, actually. So again, it comes back to these making predictions of things that we don't know about, and then actually going into it and going, oh, looks like you were right. Looks like you were right too. Well, hey, let's all have a drink.
Yeah. And see, this is one of the things that kind of Popper argued, that science can't be mostly right or somewhat wrong. A scientific theory is either right or wrong. But we know from experience now that, well, falsification is great. We don't discard a whole theory, because a scientific theory can be partly right, can be mostly right, can be partly wrong. You can have two competing theories that if you meld them together, you get a better theory.
Yep.
So, yeah.
And that's part of the whole scientific method, is that constant refinement going back round. The funniest way it's often explained is fuck around, find out. and that's it. But it is just one giant circle of going round and round, sort of trying these things, seeing what it says. There's loads of observation and data collection and, fucking around and seeing what happens and feeding that back in and going back to what Feckenel said, becoming less and less wrong. Yeah. I think that's the best way I've heard anyone actually describe it. So well done.
It's perfect. Yeah.
The scientific method took us from caves to the cosmos. It fucking works. Don't get angry at ignorance. Share what you know with the calm, rational debate. So, did it take us from the caves to the cosmos? I mean, did you
No.
saying that the cavemen had the scientific method?
If we think about modern science, or science as most people think of it in modernity and postmodernity, that's very different to what science was with the Greeks. And you had the Muslims who started refining this scientific process. God, I can't remember his name now. But he actually used it in diagnostics for medicine. He used a kind of similar idea to gather information, test that, apply that. But when you go back further and further, it's less and less like science. And once you go back to, say, 7000 BC, there's no science. There's just, oh, fuck. My friend ate this mushroom and he died. I won't eat that mushroom.
Yeah. Which you could say is the very beginning of the scientific method. And you could say from
at a push.
Yeah. But you could say that you see other creatures doing that as well. You see apes using tools, working out how to get under the tree bark and this. They're trying different things. But yes, it's a very, very loose version of science.
Yeah.
And I think
getting us out of the caves wasn't science. It was our need to look for other food sources.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think modern science, we could say modern science has only been modern science for this century, but at most, 100 years? I don't think falsification... Popper wrote it in that book in the 60s, didn't it?
Conjectures and refutations, yeah, but the demarcation of science goes way further back, way further back. And so does the beginnings of his ideas of falsification.
So... call it a century, maybe century and a half at best.
Yeah.
Is where we could say the beginnings of modern science.
The formalization, that might be a better way to put it.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. So, I like the idea though. I think we could say maybe not so much science, but the way the humans are induction machines, we are pattern-seeking creatures, and we're prone to scientific behaviors is what led us out of, led us into the cosmos and led us to science. But it wasn't exactly the scientific method. I think that's overly grandiose statement, should I say? But yes, where are we going? Randolph says Richard Dawkins has a lot to say on many subjects, but he does have his areas of expertise too. Yes, he does. He has a lot to say on many subjects, and generally, when he steps out of his areas of expertise, he gets a lot wrong. But in the areas that he does have expertise in, he's brilliant. I really enjoyed reading the Selfish Gene, for example. Definitely one of his better books. I want to read it again, actually, though I left it on a plane. But it was one of those books that was just like, again, he wrote in a way that explained ideas in such a good way. He had like I was talking about with Stephen Law and Stephen Hawking earlier. His writing had the same feel, at least in this book. I never read the God Delusion, but I've heard from many people. You either have people who put it on a pedestal, or you have the people who are slightly more philosophically or theologically minded that go, it's a load of shit. I can't judge because I haven't read it, so I can just give you the two sides of what I've heard. And being an expert doesn't guarantee infallibility. Even experts can be wrong, and sometimes, oh yeah, of course they are. Even in the fields that they're correct, they're experts in, they can easily be wrong in those things. And yes, you're right. Citing experts with the relevant expertise, it's very, very important. It's what makes it less fallacious or not fallacious, and it depends on how you're using that citation, especially if it's I'm citing them as part of this. So if you're citing multiple experts and there's this consensus and they've all got the relevant expertise, it's very different to, yeah, well, this one guy I saw in a pub, he said this, or citing an expert without the relevant expertise. Yeah, so Lone Wolf says, I just think back to the multiple experts who were scientists, doctors, and nurses who were all speaking out against the COVID vaccinations on my Facebook timeline for the last few years, and I cringe. Yeah, I mean, that's awful. But again, if you actually think about the consensus, it was what? 98% were for, and it was just a loud minority that were giving things. And you know what? Some of them... some of the people who were apparently registered nurses and the like weren't actually registered nurses. They were found to be completely fraudulent. They didn't even work in hospitals or anything like that. They were just doing it, to stir up shit. So yeah, it's frustrating. Reason to Doubt says, if a large number of experts agree, that should raise our confidence in their conclusion. Not to 100%, but we don't need 100% certainty. No, I agree. I mean, to believe something, you don't need 100% certainty. It just needs to be the most probable. At the end of the day... Sorry, go for it, Dave.
Oh, no, go for it. Sorry.
I was just going to say the way to think about, evidence or justification for your belief is anything that raises the probability of it being true. It doesn't have to be proven true. You're not saying it's a fact. You're saying that this is what is most likely the case based on these parameters.
Yeah, I think one way to look at it is in science, you don't need absolute certainty. You need pragmatic certainty.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good way to put it as well. Reason to Doubt. Atheists. You can't believe experts. That's an argument from authority. Also atheists. I know this is true because Richard Carrier said so.
Yeah, that's a brilliant one.
Yes. So if you don't know who Richard Carrier is, he's someone who's popularized because of his Jesus mythicism thing. I don't think anybody had heard of him before that. Yeah. What can I say?
Another good example. I know atheism is just a lack of belief in God because that's what Aaron Ross said.
And he'd know more
Or
about it than
the
you.
Yeah, or the American atheists, or all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of arguments from authority that go on that are actually genuinely fallacious arguments to authority within the skeptic and atheist community.
Especially as you actually provide evidence to the contrary. And what do they turn around and say? Oh, that's an argument from authority. And you're like, so because you've quoted American atheists, that's not an argument from authority. But all of these atheists, multiple different ones who've described it differently.
Yeah.
Do you not see what you're doing? Well, no, it doesn't count because American atheists would know because they're atheists. So are all these ones?
Yeah, I've heard somebody say Paul Draper was a theist, so therefore his argument of what an atheist is just an argument from authority.
It's ridiculous. But yeah. Sorry, listen to Joe. Humans, human nature led us to science. Can someone get this man a Captain Obvious hat? I deserve that one. Thank you. Daniel Kelly. Dawkins on language and biology. Breathtaking. Dawkins on religion or gender. Also breathtaking, just not in a good way.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah, cool. We caught up with the chat. Just going on about the nurses. So Lone Wolf is going on saying that the nurses that really killed my soul were the local ones, were all local friends, many of them registered nurses. It wasn't national people, it was the people, experts that we knew hurt the most in Mississippi. These are the same RNs that who have delivered our kids, saved our lives, the people we turn to for our most private medical issues, so it cut deeper. Yeah, I guess it would. I mean, it throws doubt on things that you've been told historically, doesn't it? If, have I been given the right medicine and things like that? Obviously you're still here, so matter. But if they're poo-pooing, science, and they're supposed to be the experts in these fields, yeah, I mean, you could say that, well, if they're not virologists, they're not experts in the field. So actually, they don't necessarily know what they're talking about. They're talking from a place
going off the information that the experts give them rather than being the experts. They have a certain realm of expertise, but it's a slightly different realm of expertise to the virologist.
Exactly. So a midwife who is an anti-vaxxer, okay, it's not a good thing that she's an anti-vaxxer, but that's not her speciality. That's not what she's there for, or he's there for. So yeah, I get what you're saying, but yeah.
And this is one of the things that kind of annoys me about skeptics who keep throwing around this argument from authority, saying, well, it's just an argument from authority fallacy. When it's the correct authority, they're creating this kind of space where it's okay to doubt the experts. And sure, it's okay to be cautious of the experts. But if you're doubting all the experts and saying, well, you don't need to be an expert to have an opinion, well, what's the point of experts? And what's the point of studying for years? And when we make all laymen in the same realm of experts, it's bad for society.
Most definitely.
If you call your dentist to unplug your drain, you're probably not going to do well. You might do okay, but if you call your plumber to do your dentistry, you're going to be fucked. You're just going to stick a plunger on your mouth and keep doing that until your tooth comes out.
And then Lone Wolf says, well, keep in mind, these are the same people who are led to the medical field by Christ, or at least many of them. So they felt a calling from Christ, I guess. I hate to diminish them like that. I think there's a deep religious component to the skepticism. Normally, skepticism is healthy until this component is introduced. Yeah, I do find that kind of odd as well. I mean, if you've been drawn to the medical field by God or Jesus or whatever, and then go, well, actually, I'm just going to reject what this medical field says, doesn't seem to make sense to me. In any way, shape, or form. But again, you know, a lot of these people have been influenced by a lot of misinformation, and some of that's come through their churches. So they've lent on authorities that aren't even medical professionals, that have let them influence their medical opinion. And they're supposed to get their medical opinions from the medical experts. I think you'd find 0 virologists that weren't being paid by someone to say something against, you know, the COVID vaccinations and things like that. I mean, that's a big statement. That's probably, you know, easily provable false. That's probably far too much of an absolute statement, but that's the way I lean right now anyway.
I mean, you could also argue that in some senses, science and scientists have led to some of this distrust and skepticism of these authorities within certain communities, because if you think about something like the Tuskegee experiments, where Black people were experimented on without their permission and injected with syphilis just to see what would happen, you can see why some communities might have this kind of skepticism and distrust.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they address stuff like that quite a bit on New Amsterdam. I don't know if you've watched it.
No.
It's New Amsterdam. It's a public hospital in America. And there is a big bit about, you know, how the Black community especially has a lot of mistrust for you know, the medicine and the doctors and everything like that, and they delve into the various sociological things that have led them there, and you can really understand why. And again, it makes you realize that you have a sort of privilege that you didn't realize you had.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Dave, is it true that a scientific theory can be refuted but never verified?
Well, I'll give you one more example. The Broad Street pump in London. This is an old case, and it was.
You're talking about an old bird.
No. Not a pump and dump, a pump. But if you think back to the 1800s in London, most people had a common water supply. They didn't have the taps and all that we have today. So people would go to a local pump, and they would gather water from there and take it back home. Now, there was a cholera outbreak. And this doctor came in, and he basically used science, and he kind of gathered all the data. And he found that all of it seemed to be centered around this one pump. But there were outliers. So there was this doubt, you know, what was it, the pump? But what they found was that these outliers went to school in that area. So they were connected to the pump. So he hypothesized that it was the pump that was causing the cholera outbreak. They closed the pump and the cholera disappeared. So there's a case of a scientific theory that was proved. It wasn't refuted, it was proved.
So are we saying that that's actually the full theory, or would that sit in the realm of a hypothesis that was
Well, it was tested.
Yeah.
It was tested, proven to be the case, and so it was accepted as the truth of what it was. He cured the cholera. All of his deductions and all of his hypotheses played out. So you could say that that scientific theory was one that was proved. So I guess if you're going to say, can a scientific theory be refuted but never verified? I would say that there are general theories that are always refuted but never verified or never proved to be true. But there are also certain local theories, scientific theories, that can be proved. They can be verified rather than refuted.
I suppose on a smaller scale, I suppose something with like evolution. I mean, you think about evolution, that there are certain facts. Like evolution is a fact. The theory of evolution is what explains those facts. We could say that we, through experimentation, will never be able to absolutely prove it true. Maybe certain mechanisms seem to work. But all we'd be able to do is prove parts of that theory false. I don't think we'd ever throw the whole thing out, not with how far along we are, but parts of it could be proved false. Oh, this mechanism doesn't actually work like we thought it did. Let's go back to the drawing board on that one. But something that is a bit smaller, like you're saying, with, well, there's this well, it has it in it. But I'm still wondering if that counts as a scientific theory, or if that's actually just at the hypothesis stage. You know, he's got.
Well, if a scientific theory is a hypothesis where data has been gathered enough to rank it up from just conjecture, then it seems to be a scientific theory.
Yeah, it's supposed to be something that explains all the data once you've done your experimentation and sort of shown it. So,
and that cholera pump example explains all the data.
Exactly. So, small scale theory. Yeah, you could say that actually you could prove at least parts of it true, in the same way that you might say you generally, when you're with a theory, you're only proving parts of it false. You know, bigger bits, even certain parts of evolution, you might say, well, actually, maybe we have proved this bit true. I don't think necessarily you would, because again, you're back into the whole inductive realm of we've seen this happen over and over again, and this seems to be the case. We've done the a million tests with bacteria or whatever. But that's interesting. So you could say on a small scale, you can actually prove certain theory true. Sometimes, probably rarely.
Yeah.
But
framework theories is a different matter to a localized kind of event.
Yeah. I think this is, hearing the question, generally when I think of a scientific theory, I do think of something bigger, like
you think of a framework.
Evolution. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And in that regard, I think, yes, that statement's true. It will only be refuted or refuted in part, never completely verified. But yeah, no, I take on board what you're saying there with something a little bit smaller scale. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, do you have any questions on tonight's topic? We have a comment from Reason to Doubt. Says, one thing that people tend to misunderstand is that a theory being later falsified doesn't retroactively make its good predictions wrong. Any new theory has to also match those good predictions. Exactly. So that's sort of what we were saying earlier, is a theory is never fully rejected, or rarely fully rejected anyway, at least through the modern realm. It will have certain bits cut out of it, refined, maybe included in other theories or whatever. So as you say, any new theory has to match those good predictions. And to get there, it may use the same method of that older theory. It's just, maybe 80% of that older theory has actually been shown to be crap, and keep the 20% good bit. Nice to see you, Daniel. Have yourself a good one. Thanks for making the iron a bit more enjoyable. I don't think I've ironed in ever.
That's why I wear t-shirts all the time. You don't have to iron them.
Exactly. Relativity and Newtonian physics makes extremely similar predictions in the region for which Newtonian physics made good predictions. Yeah, that's the example Dave brought up earlier. So yeah. And you can still use sort of Newtonian stuff on a more local scale, can't you?
On a smaller scale, yeah.
It still sort of works for that. You don't need to go into the theory of relativity because that's far more complex, and but yeah. So Dave, is there anything that you wanted to cover off?
No, but that pretty much covers it. It's a good basic introduction, and it explains the kind of things that you'll be looking at in an undergrad, hopefully. Like I say, some syllabuses are different, but science is considered a pretty important part of epistemology these days. It's one of the best ways to get knowledge about the real world. So it will be something that you cover in an undergrad, and you will be asking questions like this and learning about copyright and falsification, the scientific revolutions of Thomas Kuhn, and things like that.
So, I mean, it's interesting there because, I mean, people will have a big issue with philosophy, like we've mentioned, yet at least part of your degree seems very dedicated towards science.
A real world application, yeah. And a lot of people will say, well, science is just philosophy is just opinions. Well, this seems to be the case where, okay, it's an opinion, but it seems to be an opinion that's adopted. And many of these people who are saying philosophy is useless are repeating much of what this opinion is and arguing for it. It's like, well, that's not falsifiable. So, okay, but where does that falsifiable thing come from? Well, it's something you call just an opinion.
Yeah, well, it's an opinion that was accepted by scientists, so therefore it's science. Lionel says, I agree, science is the best way to get pissed off at Molly these days. I mean, that must be pretty shit Molly you're getting from your science. So Thursday we're going to be covering off the Kalam is valid. So that's a statement that you hear. We're going to be talking about the Kalam, but we're going to be approaching it a different way. So obviously from a logical standpoint, you understand that it is logically valid. But we're going to go and attack this more from a language game perspective and have a chat about, well, that in more detail, basically.
Yeah. Basically, look at the arguments. Like, you get a lot of atheists who go, no, the Kalam isn't valid. And when you point out, well, yes, in logic, it's valid, because it is, the structure is right. But you'll still get atheists and skeptics who go, no, that's not valid. You don't get to tell me how to use the word valid. So it's not valid. And we're going to be looking at that.
Yeah. And hopefully it should be a really enjoyable one. So far, we haven't got anything booked in for next week, so I can't let you know about that. I had some ideas after the stream, the last stream Dave and I did together, and I haven't been able to remember what they were. I'm hoping they come back to me. But yeah, we'll definitely have a lot more, and there'll be a lot more Plato's Raves coming out as well, because I'm enjoying them more and more. I do apologize again for stacking it so hard a couple of times tonight. Thankfully, I don't think anybody really noticed. And obviously, all of our audience who've joined us here for any part of the show, thank you so much. really good having you here. Love the interaction. Hopefully you can join us soon. I've also been speaking to Craig Reed recently, and he's going to come on and talk about his version of Christianity at some point in the future. And if any of you have anything you'd like to discuss with us, please just get in contact. We're at Answers in Reason on Twitter. Just DM us there, or get us on Facebook, and we'll have a chat and put a show together, because I'd love more interaction with you folks. I love chatting to you in the chat, but I'd love you on here with us as well.
Yeah.
We also need to do another free-for-all at some point, but I don't think I can quite handle one at the moment. If you haven't been around for the free-for-alls, it's basically a marathon stream that goes on for about 7 hours, where everybody gets on and just chats about whatever they want. But amazingly, I think there was a time when we had 12 people on. Everybody gave everybody a chance to speak. It was amazing. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, thank you, absolutely everyone. I would like to say, just before we go, though, if you haven't already, make sure you check out Luke's Distorted Thinking that he did on Monday. So it's his psych stream, Distorted Thinking. It's definitely worth checking out. Anyway, have yourselves a good one, everybody.